This is Anish Chauhan and this is Equilibrium Security. It's time to tackle your biggest cyber security challenges head on. Hello and welcome to our latest episode of our podcast. This time we are, as you can see, we're doing a video version of it, but nonetheless we do always have a guest speaker, and this time is no different. We are joined by Jon Begley, who is Group CISO of a global travel retailer. Hello, Jon.
Hi, Anish. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So we make no assumptions on this podcast. So just for those that don't know, what's a CISO?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it stands for Chief Information Security Officer. So my role on a daily basis is to make sure that the business is operating safely and securely from a technical perspective.
Yeah.
But also it strays into the realms of physical security as well. So a lot of our, your access into buildings now is physical security. Is digitally controlled, I should say. Mm-hmm. So that comes into the realm, but also making sure our data is secure, making sure our servers, applications, and it's in the end goal both safe for our employees and customers.
How did you find yourself in this role? How did you get to become a CISO of such a large organisation?
Yeah, so I guess it's an interesting question. CISOs come from all different walks of life. Some from a chief technology officer into the business, probably some from different walks of finance or business development, etc. Mine was from incident response. Okay. So prominently what CISOs don't want to find themselves in,
Sure.
in large incidents. That's where my career really started, and my passion for this industry really, I guess, was initiated, was this urge to help customers in times of crisis.
Yeah.
And it started being really technical. So hands-on, bits in the bytes, analysis, etc. And then throughout the years, it kind of transitioned from being hands-on to helping clients understand what the breach means to their business.
Yeah.
And then that developed into a trusted advisor role, being a virtual CISO for a number of organizations. Yeah. And then kind of transitioned to the Chief Information Security Officer that's today.
Okay, brilliant. So you mentioned incident response. That's an interesting route to be coming into it. How did you find the skills that you've picked up? How have they prepared you for being in this role?
They've prepared me quite well, actually. It's a really good question. I've never thought of it that way, to how my early career has kind of set me up for this. But I think we spend quite a lot of our time with stakeholder management, I guess. Mm-hmm. So taking something that's really technical, like we've had a type of malware deployed on a system, or an email that's left the organization, from a technical control, translating that to a reason that the business understands. So I think that happens quite at a pace when you're at an incident, because you have to constantly picking up little tidbits of information. That's things like, a server has been impacted by ransomware, or this server's been taken offline and compromised, and you have to articulate the technical, this is a Windows Server 2008 running MySQL, etc. And you have to translate that very technical knowledge into something that the business can understand. Say, actually, Anish, what's just happened is your whole finance system that your business is run on has just been encrypted by the business. Therefore, you can't take payments, you can't send invoices. So throughout the whole career, I've done that, but it's just been probably different stakeholders and different ways of saying it, I think, throughout my career. So it's prepared me quite well, I'd say. Okay.
And you mentioned technology, like cybersecurity is a lucrative industry, and so there's lots of technology companies that claim to be able to resolve an issue, and incident response, I think, is one of them. What kind of part does technology play in being able to respond to an incident, or the whole incident response thing?
Yeah, the fact you say incident response thing, it does almost seem like this bit of a mythical world that no one really wants to get into. Once most customers get into that mind state, or businesses, they never want to forget it again, and they don't want to be in the position where they can't trade, or they're having to have really difficult conversations with the ICO, so the Information Commissioner's Office, DWI, Department of Water Inspectors. There's lots of regulators that you don't realise have to be informed when you have an incident. But the technology part of it, I think, is what would help you mitigate it in its first instance. So you don't want to shy the business away from that incidents never happen, because that mantra is just going to get you nowhere, because they will always happen.
Yeah.
But it's how you highlight the fact that small incidents happen every day, and we're stopping them at the door, or the really early on in the kill chain, so it's not materializing into that really big incident that's like ransomware of 10,000 devices.
Sure.
It's just one person in HR's clicked on a phishing email.
Yeah.
And you've isolated that
at that point. Yeah. So I guess it's like people, you use the term incident response and people think exactly what you said, big ransomware attack, whole company's offline. So the technology plays a part in helping to mitigate that. But I think you touched on the fact that there's more to it than that. So, what other components are there really beyond the technology?
I think there's three main core components of it. You've got the technology being the bit that will give you the insight into the business. So whether that's from an email perspective, so being able to see emails that are transiting the boundary of your business or internally, and the kind of data they contain. So that's one way. So that's just a pure technological insight into the business that technology will give you. What you then need to say, and let's say, for instance, the businesses or the technology has detected that Anish has sent a national insurance number or 12 national insurance numbers outside the business. So there's an email with 12 attachments, all of which contain a national insurance number.
Okay.
That's an alert. You need a person to be able to interpret that. So if someone looks at it and go, well, actually, Anish has just sent 12 months worth of pay slips outside the business. That's someone interpret it, and then you need the process which follows that. So the process is then saying, well, the technology's detected it. The process is, let's go check with Anish to say, Anish, why have you sent 12 pay slips externally? And you may come back and say, well, John, that's because I want to keep my pay slips at home for my personal records, for instance. So it's those core three elements that will stop you from getting an incident in the first instance.
So you say the people, the process, and the technology. So it's almost like the technology by itself doesn't have any context. A person by themselves can't review hundreds of thousands of logs and events, and then the process is kind of pins it together. I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but
exactly that. That's exactly, and that goes for any tool. Would be whether it's something that's running on your endpoint, so it's a new application that's installed, etc. Whether it's for a firewall, all of these. There's lots of buzzwords, I guess, of tooling that you could throw at a solution. But unless you've got the people with the technical knowledge to drive that technology and the process, you're just as weak as, you can't survive one without the other. And similarly, if you put too much emphasis in one of those key areas, that's where you really can fall vulnerable. So for instance, if you always go to one specific individual for an answer and they're on holiday or they leave the business, that whole process falls down. And the same with technology. If you're so dependent on your endpoint detections and you're not taking into consideration firewall or maybe Office 365, you've got gaps. So
okay, great. So going back to the technology for a moment, what types of alerts could be generated? What types of alerts are generated by some sort of technology?
I mean, you could generate it on anything these days. You've got it from, as I think I already touched on, emails being sent in and out. If you're a Microsoft house, you've got SharePoint, Teams, you've got this whole ecosystem that you can have alerts on around data itself and where data sits in the environment. If you think of it from a more cyber perspective, what people typically think of cybersecurity is something that is on an endpoint. You've got your traditional antivirus or endpoint detection response tooling as well. Next generation firewalls.
So I guess if the data's there, any alert could be generated. But I guess it's what's of interest to you as a business, so your organization. So what might be relevant to one company might not necessarily be relevant to another, and and obviously vice versa.
And I think that's an interesting point as well. So make sure your business priorities align back to where you're investing in your technology, where you're investing in your people and process. Because if you take a legal or a law firm, for instance, their data is going to be at the pinnacle of their importance for them. Whereas there may be other businesses where data is not as prevalent, and maybe it's uptime and availability that's, if take a website, for example, you're not going to be worried about if someone starts stealing a load of content from your blog that's a publicly available website, because it's for the
Public
taking
available
anyway.
Yeah.
But if someone took your website offline, that's where you're going to be more concerned around.
Sure.
So it's different business priorities.
It's having the risk, right? Yeah, sure. On the subject of there being, incidents and things that concern some businesses, when we say incident response, when we say an incident, we think about the big headline events that hit the news. So if people, process, and technology are the three kind of pillars to this, really, if you want to call it that, why are these incidents still happening? Is it because are these businesses being led by technology, or are they too reliant on people, or where do you feel that the big headline events are going wrong?
It's probably what you just said, where one of those, for some reason, has not worked, or they haven't communicated, or they haven't really clicked together. You need all three to be able to successfully contain an incident. You need those three things. I can't tell you how many organizations I went in when I was in the incident response teams, where there was an alert that was sat in a console that no one actioned. There's a bit of suspicious activity where someone's moving around the environment in an unauthorized manner, but they just didn't have the process to say, come someone go and check that out. Because that was the start of, your ransomware. It's how a lot of ransomware will happen, right?
Yeah.
Which is quite prevalent.
Something happens and undetected.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously only those big events make the news, but like you said, you touched on before, the fact that an incident could be anything. It could be someone sending an email. Those incidents obviously don't make the news because they're not interesting stories, I guess.
Yeah.
But I guess for the same token, something needs to go around that process, like what you've just touched on, the fact that something needs to underpin the fact that something wasn't followed. So how would you recommend people deal with the smaller incidents, or handle, the smaller incidents, to prevent something turning into something much bigger?
I think socializing them. So no matter how big or small your incident is, socializing them with the relevant business stakeholders. So I'm very fortunate in my current position where I have really good oversight from the leadership team.
Right.
But it's making sure that an incident is always going to happen. It's just the size of the incident. So what you don't want to do is be in a position where all the little small incidents that go on a daily basis, you're not raising those. So it's not normality that incidents happen. So for instance, the payslip scenario, that could material change to quite a significant incident if you've sent one of your colleagues payslips accidentally, etc. So the more you socialize and say, well, actually, we've had an incident today. We've had 10 incidents that are associated with, DLP, data loss prevention. We've had 5 that are that were associated with endpoint devices, etc. And here's how timely we close these incidents out to give the execs and stakeholders that this is still going on in our environment. It's not, we haven't just thrown a load of money at a tool and a team and the whole problem's gone away. We're just reducing the time that it takes to respond to these incidents. So you don't have, and the impact. So you don't have a massive ransomware incident that takes your whole system offline, or you have someone exfiltrate terabytes of data. You just have one person who clicked on a phishing email, and we redacted that email or quarantined it, etc. It's these isolated incidents.
Okay. It sounds like in your current position, you're supported quite well with, key stakeholders. How important is communication? Like we always say in lots of industries and in lots of areas of cybersecurity that communication is really important. How key is it in incident response?
Incident response, it's essential. It's probably the only way you can get through an incident. And although the conversations are sometimes really hard, difficult to have, tell a senior executive that, or anyone in the business, that we've just had someone exfiltrate gigabytes or terabytes of data from our environment, or our whole website where we generate our business is offline, our factory. They're really difficult conversations to have.
It's easy to bury your head in the sand, I imagine, isn't it?
But the earlier you have those conversations, the better. Because what you'll typically find is the executive committee will feel really upset if you don't have those conversations early on. Because they'll just want to feel like, well, why didn't you tell me? Because I could have helped you. I could have given you more resource. If we'd have bought this tool for X amount of pounds or dollars, it would have helped you, and we've got the business back online faster. So the difficult conversations to have, but my advice would always be to socialize them sooner. The only challenge with that is if you're maybe new to a business or starting to socialize these for the first time, you will start to get challenged and say, well, even if it's a minute things, Anish has sent some, and I keep going back to this, but it's a really practical example of the payslips leaving the environment. Anish did that, our process detected it, we spoke to Anish and we closed that incident down in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
It's like, at first they might be startled, say, well, why are you telling me this information? And you have to get them on the journey that I'm just informing you, and kind of build that trust and rapport up with the execs and
almost not to give them this belief that nothing ever happens and then suddenly this huge thing has happened. Okay, so John, like we've talked a lot about incident response. How do you stop it from happening? Is there a way in which we can businesses can learn from past incidents, or well, I won't put words in your mouth, but how do we stop it from happening?
So incident response, I guess the name is in the title somewhat. You could have a plan on how you're going to
respond to an incident.
respond to an incident, and that typically before you get into the plan, I think that's kind of the nature of your question, is how we don't want to get to the point where we have to invoke an incident. What do we do before that? And I think the playbooks are key. There's a lot of new technologies and buzzwords, SEAM, SOAR, so security, orchestration, automation, and response. There's lots of these, and a lot of that is automating and bringing technology in now to automate playbooks. And that's
still overlooking the people and the process element, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to be this all singing or dancing system or SOAR platform. It could just be a playbook that is, once we get alert A from this, whether it's an EDR tool, whether it's your firewalls, whatever it may be, once we get alert A, what do we do then to make sure that that's closed and the risk is reduced to our business? So whether that is the payslip example again, whether that is we get this alert, we then contact the user, say, can you please confirm the business use for you sending this information outside the business? And then if the user comes back and says, yes, this was me, and the response is valid, then you close the incident. If not, you then you maybe invoke a major incident and you go to your incident response plan. And then that's where you start to bring in some of the key stakeholders, maybe a data protection officer, inform more people in the business that need to be made aware. And I think the most important thing, which is commonly overlooked, is whatever lessons you learn, feed them back into both the playbooks and the plan, so that next time you either get a prompt response from the user or the closure of the ticket, and that you can hopefully close the incident out before it gets to escalate.
Yeah, and that you've touched on a point which I was going to ask you actually. How often should something like that, if you have a plan, if you have a documented process, how often should you update this? Because invariably what happens is these processes are written and they're supposed to be reviewed on an annual basis, and then 4 weeks before it's supposed to be reviewed, there's a lot of activity around getting it updated. How often, should they be reviewed like on an ongoing basis, constantly, or?
So probably not reviewed. Maybe reviewed annually.
Updated.
But I know for we actually updated the incident response plan for the business this week. So because we'd identified that actually there's a bit of a gap in this process. It's not quite clear on how we escalate this in this type of incident. So we updated it on the fly, and that's how they should be. They should be a living, breathing document. If you've just created it for the purpose of an audit or the purpose of some business use case, and in the event of an incident, you dust it off, and it's written in 2006.
Chances are it's going to be irrelevant and not helpful.
No, on-prem Exchange probably was still a thing. Most of it's moved to cloud now. It's just
going to be waste.
And people that are in there have moved on. So the sooner you can update that, the better, really.
So the cybersecurity landscape is changing constantly. A big factor that's propelling that change is AI. How do you see that changing the field of incident response?
I think it works in our favour as defenders as much as it lends an upper hand to the adversaries as well. So there's a lot of talk really early on that they can use this to help generate phishing emails and these marketing emails that people are more susceptible to click on, and they can even use it. And anyone who's on the attacking side, the blue team side, have a play with it and see what, if you wanted to be malicious in it and create marketing material or phishing campaigns
to get an insight into what the threat is.
So you can do that, and I think so we can use it as a tool to try and understand, stay one step ahead of them. But there's a lot of vendors out there now that are also incorporating AI into their own platforms and own technologies. I think it's still very early days.
Of course,
but us on the blue team can just harness that just as much as the red team out there and the adversaries.
Okay, brilliant. So John, so we've talked about quite a lot here. There's probably a lot to digest. What would you say are the key takeaways? How does a business prepare themselves for an incident? What should they be doing if they're looking at watching this or listening to this and thinking, actually, I'm not sure if I'm in good shape here?
Running through scenarios, whether it's just there's this concept called tabletop exercises. There's a lot of businesses that may already be familiar with this, but this is really getting those, whether it's a playbook, whether it's an incident response plan, whatever it may be, just sitting down with different business stakeholders. So initially, maybe your IT team, your security team, and actually walking them through, okay, if this hypothetical incident happened, how would we respond? Would we be able to do it? And I think that can also tease out elements that you need to add into your incident response plan that you potentially overlooked. So that's one. I've said it before, people, process and tech, making sure you've got that really nailed down. And I think also understanding your unknowns is just as important as understanding what you know about the business. So for instance, if you said, I've got a really high degree of confidence that everything in all my laptops are covered with antivirus solution or etc. But my servers, I'm not sure whether we've got antivirus coverage on there or EDR, whatever it may be. That's a really, it's not a good place to be in because you want the coverage, but at least you know that actually we've got a vulnerability here. So therefore you may try to mitigate it, whether it's with additional network controls, isolation, etc. But I think understanding your unknowns and your uncertainties is just as important about the hard facts that you've got with confidence.
Okay, brilliant, John. That's been really useful. I hope you found it interesting having this conversation with me as well. And thanks very much for joining us on our first video podcast. And tune in for the next one.